The blood-red haze of dawn painted the Kansas prairie as Josephine Norwood crouched in a shallow ravine, clutching her late husband's pocket watch and listening to the distant thunder of approaching horses. 3 days had passed since Confederate raiders had burned her homestead to the ground and left her for dead beside Thomas's bullet-riddled body. 1863 had been cruel to Kansas. The war between the states had turned neighbor against neighbor, especially in border territories where loyalties shifted like the prairie wind. Josephine Jo, to those who knew her, had lost everything in a single night of violence. She pressed herself deeper into the earth as the riders passed. Their voices carried on the morning air, harsh with laughter and boasts of Union blood spilled. Jo held her breath until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Her fingers trembled against the cool metal of the watch, the last piece of the life she'd built with Thomas over their 4 years of marriage. At 23, Jo was a widow with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need to find safety. Thomas had always told her that if something happened to him, she should make for Linden, Kansas. His cousin kept a general store there, and the town's Union sympathies might offer protection from the bushwhackers who had taken everything from her. Rising from her hiding place, Jo looked across the rolling sea of grass toward the eastern horizon. Linden was nearly 30 miles away, a journey that would take days on foot through territory stalked by both Confederate raiders and desperate men taking advantage of the chaos of war. But she had no choice. Survival meant movement. By midday, the Kansas sun beat down mercilessly on Jo's fair skin. Her calico dress, torn and stained with Thomas's blood and her own, offered little protection from the elements. Her lips were cracked with thirst and hunger gnawed at her belly. She'd managed to grab only a small bundle of supplies before fleeing her burning home, a package of jerky, now nearly gone, and a canteen that held mere sips of tepid water. When she spotted the small creek cutting through a stand of cottonwood trees, Jo nearly wept with relief. She stumbled toward the water, collapsing at its edge to drink deeply from her cupped hands. The cool relief was so overwhelming that she failed to notice the approaching rider until his shadow fell across her. "Madam, you look like you've seen better days." Jo scrambled backward, fumbling for the small knife tucked in her boot, Thomas's hunting knife, the only weapon she possessed. "Stay back," she warned, her voice hoarse from smoke and thirst. The man on horseback raised his hands slowly, palms outward. "I mean you no harm." Jo took his measure quickly. Tall and lean in the saddle, with sun-weathered skin and a scruff of dark beard beneath piercing blue eyes. He wore no uniform, but a dusty range coat over simple clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features. A worn Winchester rifle rested in his saddle holster, and she could see the handle of a Colt revolver at his hip. "Zachary Mercer," he said, not moving his horse any closer. "Most folks call me Zach." "I don't care what folks call you," Jo replied, knife still raised. "I've nothing worth taking." Something flickered in the man's eyes, something like understanding, perhaps even compassion. "I'm not looking to take anything, madam, just concerned to find a lady alone out here. Raiders been through these parts." "I know about the raiders," Jo said bitterly. "They took everything I had 3 nights back." Zachary Mercer studied her for a long moment, then slowly dismounted, keeping his distance. "You're heading somewhere, family waiting," Jo hesitated, weighing the risk of truth against lies. "Linden, my husband's cousin, has a store there." "Had," the man corrected gently. "Raiders hit Linden 2 days ago. Not much left of the town, including Peterson's general store. I just came from there." The news hit Jo like a physical blow. Her last hope of sanctuary crumbled, and she sank back against the creek bank, the knife falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. "There's nowhere left," she whispered, more to herself than to the stranger. Zachary approached slowly, as one might a wounded animal. "I've got a ranch about 15 miles west of here. Small place, but it's secure. Got a few hands keeping watch. You'd be safe there until you figure your next move." Jo's laugh was sharp and humorless. "A strange man offers shelter to a woman alone. I may be desperate, sir, but I'm not a fool." "No, madam, you certainly don't strike me as foolish." He crouched down a respectful distance away. But these are desperate times. I lost my brother at Antietam last year. He had a wife about your age. Never got to say goodbye to her. Maybe that's why I can't just ride past a lady in need." His words carried the weight of truth, but Joe had learned that men could lie with conviction. "What would you want in return?" "Nothing." The answer came swift and firm. "My ranch needs tending same as any place. If you want to help with cooking or other chores while you're there, that would be welcome, but it's not a condition of shelter." Joe studied his face, looking for deceit. His eyes met hers steadily. After a moment, she realized she had little choice. Death awaited her on the open prairie from exposure, starvation, or worse if the raiders found her. "I don't even know you," she said finally. "No, madam, you don't. But I give you my word as a man who still believes words mean something, you'll come to no harm under my protection." Joe weighed her options quickly. Death was certain if she continued alone. With this stranger, there was at least a chance of survival. "I accept your offer, Mr. Mercer," she said finally, "but know that I sleep light and can use this knife." For the first time, a smile crossed the man's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I'd expect nothing less, Mrs. Norwood, Josephine Norwood." "Well, Mrs. Norwood, my horse can carry us both until sunset. We'll make the ranch by nightfall if we push on." Joe gathered her meager belongings and accepted his hand up onto the horse, settling behind him on the saddle. As they rode west across the Kansas prairie, she maintained a careful distance, her hands resting lightly at his sides rather than embracing him fully. "How long have you had your ranch, Mr. Mercer?" she asked, seeking information rather than conversation. 5 years. Came out from Pennsylvania after the gold rush proved less than golden for me. Figured cattle were a surer bet than nuggets. And the war hasn't touched you." Zachary's shoulders tensed slightly. "It's touched everyone, Mrs. Norwood, but I've managed to keep my small piece of land neutral. Pay Confederate raiders in beef when they come through, same for Union patrols. Most leave satisfied enough." "A dangerous game," Joe observed. "Less dangerous than choosing sides out here," he glanced back at her. "Your husband was Union, I take it," Joe nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Yes, though he never enlisted. We were just trying to make our homestead work." Raiders don't much care about the difference between sympathizers and soldiers. They rode in silence after that, the rhythm of the horses' hooves marking the passage of hours. By late afternoon, Joe's body ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she made no complaint. The vast prairie rolled endlessly before them, broken occasionally by stands of trees or shallow creeks. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Joe spotted the first signs of habitation, a split-rail fence marking property lines, then cattle grazing in the distance. Finally, a cluster of buildings came into view. A modest ranch house built of timber and stone, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. "Mercer Ranch," Zachary announced. "Not much to look at, but it's home." As they approached, 2 men emerged from the barn, rifles ready. Upon recognizing Zachary, they lowered their weapons and approached. "Found trouble in town, boss," called the older of the two, eyeing Joe with undisguised curiosity. "Found someone needing help, Charlie. Mrs. Norwood's place was hit by raiders. She'll be staying with us for a while." Charlie, a grizzled man with a limp and graying beard, tipped his hat to Joe. The younger man beside him, barely out of his teens with a shock of red hair, looked uncomfortable in her presence. "This is Charlie Wilkins, my foreman," Zachary explained, "and that's Billy Thompson, newest hand. Inside you'll meet Rosa, who keeps the house. That's the entire Mercer Ranch family." Joe nodded to the men, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance and the dried blood on her dress. "Thank you for the welcome." Zachary dismounted and reached up to help her down. When her feet touched the ground, her legs nearly buckled from exhaustion. He steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Charlie, tell Rosa we need hot water for a bath and to prepare the back bedroom." He turned to Joe. "Come inside, Mrs. Norwood. You look dead on your feet." The ranch house was simple but comfortable, with solid furniture and clean surfaces. A Mexican woman in her 50s appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "Rosa, this is Mrs. Norwood. She'll be our guest for a while." Rosa's dark eyes took in Joe's condition with a swift, assessing glance. Without a word, she turned and disappeared down a hallway, returning moments later with a clean dress over her arm. "For now," she said, her English accented but clear. "Bath ready soon." Joe felt tears prick her eyes at this simple kindness. "Thank you." Zachary cleared his throat. "I'll leave you in Rosa's capable hands. There's food when you're ready." An hour later, clean for the first time in days and dressed in a simple cotton dress that was slightly too large, Joe sat at the kitchen table before a bowl of stew and freshly baked bread. The men had eaten earlier and were out seeing to evening chores, leaving her alone with Rosa. "You eat," Rosa insisted, watching Joe with maternal concern. "Too thin." Joe didn't need encouragement. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, the best meal she'd had in months. Even before the raiders came, food had grown scarce as the war disrupted supply lines. "How long have you worked for Mr. Mercer?" Joe asked between bites. 3 years, since my Manuel died. Mr. Zach, he good man, quiet but good." Joe considered this. "And he often brings home strays." Rosa's smile was knowing. "You not stray, senora, you survivor." "Mr. Zach knows difference." Before Joe could respond, the back door opened and Zachary entered, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His eyes found Joe immediately, seeming to assess her improved condition. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Yes, thank you. Your hospitality is unexpected but appreciated." He nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "I've had Charlie make up the bunkhouse for me. You'll take my room while you're here." "I couldn't, you can and will," he interrupted firmly. "It's settled." Rosa exchanged a glance with Joe that seemed to say, "I told you so," before excusing herself to her own quarters off the kitchen. Left alone with her benefactor, Joe felt awkward silence descend. "Mr. Mercer, Zach," he corrected. "Out here formality seems foolish." "Zach," she amended. "I want to be clear about my situation. My husband is dead, our farm is ashes, I have no money and nowhere to go. I accept your generosity, but I need to know what you truly expect in return." He studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I told you on the prairie nothing." "Men always want something." "Not all men, Mrs. Norwood." "Joe," she said, surprising herself, "if we're abandoning formality." A slight smile touched his lips. "Joe, then, I expect nothing from you except that you recover your strength and help around the ranch if you're able. When you decide where you want to go next, I'll help you get there safely. That's all." She searched his face for deception and found none. "Why?" Zach set down his cup, his expression turning somber. "Because this war has taken enough. Because my brother would want me to help his countrymen and women, because it's what decent folk should do." Joe felt something tight inside her chest loosen slightly. "Thank you," he nodded once. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." That night, lying in a stranger's bed with clean sheets and a solid roof over her head for the first time in days, Joe allowed herself to weep quietly for all she had lost. Thomas, their small farm, the future they had planned together, all gone in a night of violence. She clutched his pocket watch and whispered a prayer for his soul, wondering how she would ever rebuild her life from ashes. When sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of fire and the thunder of hooves. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee and bacon. Joe dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes, simple but clean, and made her way to the kitchen. Rosa was already cooking, and the men's voices carried from the front porch. "Buenos dias," Rosa greeted. "You sleep good." "Better than I have in days," Joe admitted. "What can I help with?" Rosa pointed to a basket of eggs. "You can gather more from henhouse. Men eat many eggs." Joe took the basket and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The ranch looked different in daylight, more substantial and well kept than it had appeared at dusk. A dozen cattle grazed in a nearby pasture, and she could see a vegetable garden behind the house. As she approached the chicken coop, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Zach. "Morning," he said. "Hope you slept well." "I did, thank you." He gestured toward the chicken coop. "Be careful of the red hen. She's mean as a snake." Joe smiled slightly. "I had chickens at our farm. I know their ways." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before he spoke again. "I need to ride into Willow Creek today for supplies. It's a small settlement about 10 miles south that the raiders haven't found yet. Would you like to come along? Might do you good to get a sense of the area. Joe considered the offer. Yes, I think I would, thank you. We'll leave after breakfast. If you need anything particular, we can look for it there. Joe thought of her few possessions, the clothes on her back, Thomas's pocket watch and knife, and little else. Perhaps some fabric for a dress. I can't keep wearing Rosa's clothes. Consider it done. After breakfast, Joe found herself once again on horseback, this time on a gentle mare Zach called Daisy. They rode south across the prairie, the morning sun warming their backs. Joe found herself studying her companion as they traveled. In daylight, she could see that he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or 32. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar, and his beard was neatly trimmed. He rode with the easy confidence of a man at home in the saddle. "How did you come to Kansas?" she asked as they rode. "Like most folks looking for something. My father was a banker in Philadelphia, expected me to follow in his footsteps. I had other ideas." He glanced at her. "What about you? You're not from frontier stock, I'd wager." Joe was surprised by his perception. "Is it that obvious?" "My father was a schoolteacher in Indiana. Thomas and I came west after we married. He had dreams of building something of our own." "Teachers' daughters and bankers' sons," Zach mused. "The frontier makes strange neighbors of us all." The settlement of Willow Creek proved to be little more than a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads, a general store, a smithy, a small church, and a few rough houses. But to Joe, who had feared she might never see civilization again, it was a welcome sight. The proprietor of the general store, a thin man named Jenkins, greeted Zach with familiarity. "Mercer thought the raiders might have got you." "Not yet, Jenkins, though they hit Linden hard." "Heard that. Bad business." Jenkins's gaze shifted to Joe, curiosity evident. "This is Mrs. Norwood," Zach said simply. "She's staying at the ranch for a while." Something in his tone discouraged further questions. Jenkins merely nodded and turned to business. "What can I get you today?" As Zach arranged for supplies to be loaded into a wagon he'd brought along, Joe browsed the store's meager offerings. She selected a bolt of serviceable blue cotton, some thread, and a packet of needles enough to fashion a simple dress. "Add that to my order," Zach instructed Jenkins when she brought her selections to the counter. "You don't have to," Joe began. "Consider it an advance on your help at the ranch," he said firmly. Outside the store, as they waited for the supplies to be loaded, Joe noticed a poster nailed to a post. It announced a reward for information leading to the capture of Confederate raiders operating in the area. The description matched the men who had attacked her farm. "They've been hitting homesteads all along the border," Zach explained, following her gaze. "Claiming to be fighting for the South, but they're just thieves using the war as cover. They killed Thomas because he refused to tell them where we kept our savings," Joe said quietly. "We didn't have any savings, everything went into the farm." Zach's expression darkened. "I'm sorry, Joe. This war has brought out the worst in men." "Not all men," she replied, meeting his eyes. Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding that made Joe look away first, unsettled by the warmth it kindled in her chest. It felt disloyal to Thomas, whose body was barely cold. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Charlie met them with news. "Patrol of Union soldiers came by, boss. Looking for deserters," they said. "Told them we hadn't seen any." Zach nodded, his expression grim. "They'll be back. Union or Confederate, they're all looking for someone to blame for this mess." That evening, after dinner, Joe sat on the porch with her sewing, fashioning a simple dress from the fabric they'd purchased. The rhythmic work of needle and thread was soothing, a reminder of simpler times before the world had erupted in violence. Zach joined her after a while, a cup of coffee in his hands. He sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. "My brother James was a lot like your Thomas, I think. Believed in the Union cause with his whole heart. Enlisted the first day he could." Joe's hands stilled. "You didn't follow him?" Zach shook his head. "I've seen enough killing in my time. Worked as a scout for the Army years back against the Comanche. Saw things men shouldn't see or do to one another. When this war came, I couldn't put on another uniform." "Thomas didn't enlist either," Joe said softly. He believed in the Union, but he believed more in building something lasting. He said we couldn't fight for freedom if we didn't know what we were fighting for. Zach nodded, understanding in his eyes. Wise man. He was. Jo resumed her sewing, blinking back tears. I keep thinking I should have done something. When they came, I hid in the root cellar. I heard them questioning him, heard the shots. I did nothing. You survived, Zach said firmly. That's not nothing, Jo, that's everything. His words penetrated the shell of guilt she'd built around herself. I don't know how to start again. Everything we built is gone. You start by waking up each morning, by doing what needs doing that day. The rest comes with time. Jo studied him in the fading light. Is that how you did it? After your brother? I'm still working on it, he admitted. Some days are better than others. They sat in companionable silence until darkness fell completely, the only sounds the chirp of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Jo found comfort in his presence, not demanding anything of her, just offering quiet company in her grief. The days that followed settled into a routine. Jo helped Rosa with the cooking and household chores, gathered eggs, and tended the vegetable garden. She finished her new dress and began another from fabric Rosa had stored away. The work kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too much on all she had lost. Zach was often busy with ranch work, riding out early with Charlie and Billy to check on cattle or mend fences. But he made a point of joining Jo on the porch most evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. A week after her arrival, Jo was hanging laundry when she heard riders approaching. Her heart seized with fear until she saw Zach among them, returning with Charlie from checking the north pasture. Riders coming, he called as soon as he was within earshot. Get inside and stay there. Jo rushed to obey, watching from the window as 6 men on horseback approached the ranch. Even from a distance, she recognized the butternut-colored uniforms of Confederate irregulars raiders like those who had attacked her farm. Zach met them in the yard, his posture relaxed but his hand never far from his sidearm. Charlie positioned himself near the barn, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down one cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. Mercer, been a while. Captain Wells, Zach acknowledged, didn't expect to see you this far north. War's changing. We go where we're needed. Wells surveyed the ranch with calculating eyes. We're requisitioning supplies for the cause. 3 head of cattle ought to do it. Jo could see the tension in Zach's shoulders, though his voice remained steady. That's steep, Wells. Last time it was 1 head. Prices go up in wartime, Wells replied with a cold smile. Unless you'd prefer we search the place for contraband. Heard you might be harboring Union sympathizers. Jo's blood ran cold. Had they traced her here? Did they know about her and Thomas? Zach's response was measured. You know I stay neutral in this fight. Take 2 head and move on. That's fair. For a tense moment, Jo feared Wells would refuse. Then he nodded curtly. 2 head and whatever food you can spare. We'll be on our way by sundown. Jo watched as Charlie and Billy rounded up 2 steers and drove them toward the raiders. Rosa packed a sack with bread and salted meat, which Zach delivered to the waiting men. All the while, Jo remained hidden, fear a metallic taste in her mouth. When the raiders finally rode away, driving the cattle before them, Jo emerged from the house. Zach stood in the yard, watching them disappear over the horizon. How often do they come? She asked, coming to stand beside him. Not often enough to ruin us, often enough to remind us they can. He turned to her, his expression grave. They were looking for someone, Jo, someone they think I'm hiding. Me, she whispered. They must have followed my trail. Zach nodded. It's possible. But they're gone now, and they won't be back for a while. Wells keeps his word, at least. I should leave, Jo said, though the thought of returning to the prairie alone terrified her. I'm putting you all in danger. No, his response was immediate and firm. This is what they want to make people so afraid they turn on each other. I won't do it. But your ranch, your people, are my responsibility, and right now so are you. His eyes met hers, unwavering. I promised you protection, Jo. That hasn't changed. That night, sleep eluded Jo. Every sound outside made her start, convinced the raiders had returned. After hours of tossing and turning, she rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, stepping out onto the porch for air. To her surprise, Zach was already there, a rifle across his knees as he kept watch. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. Joe shook her head, sitting beside him on the bench. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them, the men who killed Thomas. They won't come tonight. Wells isn't a fool. He won't risk his men for one woman. How can you be sure?" "Because I know men like him. They're cruel but calculating. The risk isn't worth the reward." Joe drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I should never have come here. I've brought this trouble to your door." "Trouble finds its way to every door eventually in times like these," Zach replied. "At least this trouble has a purpose, protecting you." "It matters, Joe." The way he said it made her look up sharply. His eyes, shadowed in the darkness, held an intensity that made her breath catch. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zach was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Because in a world gone mad with killing, saving one life feels like the only sane thing left to do." He paused. "And because there's something about you, Joe Norwood. Something that reminds me there are still good things worth fighting for." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than any touch. Joe felt a flush rise to her cheeks, grateful for the darkness that hid it. "I should go back inside," she murmured, suddenly aware of how alone they were. "You should," he agreed, though neither of them moved. After a long moment, Joe rose. "Good night, Zach." "Good night, Joe," he replied, his eyes following her as she returned to the house. As April turned to May, the prairie erupted in wildflowers, painting the landscape in vibrant colors. Joe found herself settling into life at the ranch, her grief still present but no longer all-consuming. She took over more household duties, freeing Rosa to help with other tasks. She learned to ride Daisy confidently, sometimes accompanying Zach on short trips to check the property boundaries. In those hours together, she learned more about him, how he'd come west at 19 against his father's wishes, worked as an army scout, tried his hand at gold mining, and finally saved enough to buy this small piece of land. She told him about her childhood in Indiana, her father's schoolhouse where she'd developed a love of literature, her meeting Thomas at a county fair when she was 18. "He was the first man who listened to me as if my thoughts mattered," she explained as they rode along a creek one warm afternoon. "Most men just saw a schoolteacher's daughter who could cook and keep house." "Thomas sounds like a rare man," Zach observed. He was. "He believed I could be more than just someone's wife." Joe smiled at the memory. "He taught me to shoot, said a frontier woman needed to protect herself." "Did you ever have to use a gun, I mean?" "No, when the time came," she faltered. "I couldn't reach the rifle." "They came so suddenly." Zach reined his horse to a stop, turning to face her. "Joe, you can't blame yourself for surviving." "I don't, not anymore." She met his gaze steadily. "But I do blame myself for not being prepared. I won't make that mistake again." The next day, Zach brought her his spare revolver, a Colt Navy model, and took her to a clearing behind the barn. He set up bottles on a fallen log and stood beside her, showing her how to load and aim. "Thomas taught me with a rifle," Joe explained, "never a handgun." "Revolvers are better for close quarters," Zach replied. "Easier to keep nearby." Joe's first shots went wide, but by the end of an hour she was hitting the targets consistently. The feel of the weapon in her hand was both terrifying and empowering. "Keep it with you," Zach told her as they walked back to the house. "I hope you never need it, but if you do—" "Thank you," Joe said sincerely, "for not treating me like someone who needs sheltering from hard truths." His smile was warm. "I've never met a woman less in need of sheltering." Joe Norwood. As spring deepened, news of the war reached them in fragments. Union victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Confederate forces being pushed back. The raids on local farms decreased as more Union troops patrolled the territory, but the threat never entirely disappeared. Joe found herself watching Zach more often, the way he worked with the horses, gentle but firm, how he treated Rosa and the hands with unfailing respect, the quiet competence with which he managed the ranch. She noticed other things too: the breadth of his shoulders, The rare but transformative nature of his smile, the way his eyes sought her out when he returned from working the range, it troubled her, this growing awareness. Thomas had been dead barely 2 months. Her grief was still raw, her loss still acute. Yet she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her when Zach was near, or how she looked forward to their evenings on the porch, talking as the sun set over the prairie. One evening in late May, a thunderstorm swept across the plains. Rain lashed the windows and lightning split the sky as Joe helped Rosa prepare dinner. When Zach and the men hadn't returned by the usual time, worry began to gnaw at her. "They know to find shelter," Rosa reassured her, noting Joe's frequent glances toward the window. Just as they were setting the table, the back door burst open. Zach entered, soaked to the skin, carrying a small, still form in his arms. "Rosa, hot water and bandages," he ordered, laying the bundle gently on the kitchen table. Joe gasped when she saw it was a child, a boy of perhaps 10 or 11, unconscious and bleeding from a wound on his head. "Found him half drowned in the creek," Zach explained as he worked to remove the boy's sodden clothes. "Creek's flooding with the rain. He must have been swept away." Joe quickly cleared the table as Rosa returned with the requested supplies. Together they cleaned and bandaged the boy's head wound and wrapped him in warm blankets. "Where are Charlie and Billy?" Joe asked as they worked, still out looking. "There might be others." Zach's face was grim. "There's a wagon train camped about 3 miles east, must have been trying to cross before the storm hit." As if summoned by his words, the door opened again and Charlie entered, supporting a woman who appeared to be in her 30s. Her face was scratched and bleeding, her clothes torn. "Found her clinging to a tree branch," Charlie explained. "Says her name's Martha Cleary, the boy's her son James." The woman's eyes widened when she saw the child on the table. "Jamie," she cried, rushing forward despite her own injuries. "He's alive," Joe assured her quickly. "The wound looks worse than it is." Relief flooded Martha's face. "Thank God, and thank you, all of you." Over the next hour, Charlie and Billy returned with 3 more survivors from the wagon train, Martha's husband, Daniel, and another couple who had been traveling with them. The rest, they reported grimly, had either made it to higher ground or been lost to the floodwaters. The ranch house became an impromptu hospital and shelter. Joe worked tirelessly alongside Rosa to tend the injured, prepare food, and find dry clothes for everyone. When young Jamie finally regained consciousness, his mother's tearful reunion with him brought a lump to Joe's throat. Late that night, with the storm still raging outside and their guests finally settled, Joe found herself alone with Zach in the kitchen. He looked exhausted, his clothes still damp, his face lined with fatigue. "You should rest," she told him, pouring a cup of coffee and pressing it into his hands. "Too much to do," he replied, though he accepted the coffee gratefully. "Creek's still rising. Might need to move some cattle to higher ground come morning." "You saved lives today," Joe said softly. "That family would have lost their son if not for you." Zach shook his head. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't have," Joe insisted. "Most men would have looked to their own property first, not ridden out in a storm searching for strangers." He looked up at her then, something vulnerable in his gaze. "My father used to say a man's character is measured not by what he does when everyone is watching, but by what he does when no one is." "Your father was wise," Joe said, "and so is his son." Impulsively, she reached out and touched his cheek, a brief, gentle caress. The moment her fingers met his skin, something electric passed between them. Zach's breath caught and his hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his face. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Then, as if remembering herself, Joe withdrew her hand. "I should check on Martha and Jamie," she murmured, stepping back. "Joe," Zach began, but whatever he meant to say remained unspoken as Rosa entered the kitchen. "Senor Cleary asking for you," she told Zach, "about the wagons." The moment broken, Joe slipped away, her heart pounding and her fingers still tingling from the touch of his skin. The Clearys and their companions stayed at the ranch for 3 days while the floodwaters receded. Daniel Cleary proved handy with tools and helped repair storm damage to the barn, while Martha assisted with household chores. Young Jamie, recovering quickly as children do, became a favorite of everyone, his curious nature and resilient spirit bringing smiles even in the aftermath of tragedy. Jo found herself drawn to Martha, who shared her experience of traveling west in search of a better life. Unlike Jo, Martha had never known stability. She and Daniel had been moving for years, seeking the right place to settle. "You're lucky to have found a good man like Mr. Mercer," Martha commented as they hung laundry together. "In these troubled times, that's rare indeed." Jo felt her cheeks warm. "It's not what you think. I'm widowed recently. Mr. Mercer offered shelter, nothing more." Martha's knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise. "A man doesn't look at a woman the way he looks at you if he's offering nothing more, Mrs. Norwood." Before Jo could respond, Jamie came running up, excited to show them a frog he'd caught by the creek. The conversation shifted, but Martha's words lingered in Jo's mind. Was it true? Did Zach look at her in a special way, and more troubling, did she want him to? On the morning the Clearys prepared to depart, their wagon salvaged and repaired, Daniel approached Zach as the men loaded supplies. "We've decided to try for Oregon," he explained. "Fresh start away from this war," Zach nodded. "Wise choice. The trail's dangerous, but if you join up with other wagons in Council Bluffs, you'll have better odds." Daniel hesitated. "We'd be honored if you and Mrs. Norwood would consider coming with us. We need good people, and from what I've seen, you two are the best." Jo, who had been helping Martha pack food for the journey, overheard the invitation. Her eyes met Zach's across the yard. "That's kind of you," Zach replied, "but this is my home. I've put down roots here." "And you, Mrs. Norwood?" Daniel asked, turning to Jo. "You mentioned you were looking to start fresh, Oregon's fertile land, far from this conflict." Jo felt all eyes on her. The offer was tempting, a chance to travel far from Kansas and its painful memories, to build something new in a place untouched by the war that had taken Thomas. But as she considered it, Jo realized something unexpected. In the weeks since arriving at the ranch, she had begun to heal. The constant ache of loss had dulled, and in its place, she'd found purpose in daily work and comfort in the community Zach had created. The thought of leaving brought a sharp pang of regret. "Thank you, Mr. Cleary," she said finally, "but I think I need more time before making such a journey." "I'm grateful for the offer, though." Relief flashed across Zach's face so quickly she almost missed it. As the Cleary's wagon pulled away later that morning, he came to stand beside her. "You could have gone," he said quietly. "It might have been safer than staying in Kansas." "Safety isn't everything," Jo replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Sometimes you need to stay and face what frightens you." "And what frightens Josephine Norwood?" he asked, his voice low. She met his gaze steadily. "Starting over, forgetting. Moving forward when part of me still lives in the past." Understanding passed between them, the unspoken recognition that they shared this fear, this guilt of continuing to live when loved ones had perished. "The past travels with us," Zach said softly, "but it doesn't have to lead the way." As May turned to June, the summer heat settled over the prairie. The days grew longer, filled with the constant work of ranch life: cattle to tend, crops to nurture, repairs to make after the spring storms. Jo found herself stronger, both in body and spirit, than she had been in months. She had taken over much of the garden work, expanding it with Rosa's guidance to include more vegetables and even some flowers. There was satisfaction in coaxing life from the soil, in watching seeds transform into plants that would sustain them through the coming winter. One sweltering afternoon, as Jo knelt among the bean plants, Zach approached with a canteen of water. "Rosa says you've been out here since dawn," he chided gently, offering her a drink. "Even the most dedicated gardener needs shade sometimes." Jo accepted the water gratefully, wiping perspiration from her brow. "I lost track of time. The beans needed thinning, and then I saw the tomatoes needed staking, and before I knew it." Zach smiled. "You've brought this garden back to life. Rosa says she's never seen it so productive." "It feels good to create something," Jo admitted, "after so much destruction." He extended a hand to help her up. "Come see what we've been working on. Charlie and I finished it this morning." Curious, Joe followed him around to the far side of the barn, where a small structure stood that hadn't been there before, a chicken coop, freshly built with a small fenced yard attached. You mentioned wanting to expand the flock, Zach explained. Thought this might help. Joe walked around the coop, admiring the solid construction and thoughtful details, nesting boxes at the right height, a small door that could be closed at night to protect against predators, even a covered area where the chickens could dust bathe during rain. It's perfect, she said, genuinely touched by the gesture. But you didn't have to do this. Wanted to, he replied simply. Then, with a hint of uncertainty unusual for him, I was hoping it might convince you to stay, not just for now, but longer. The implication hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about chickens or gardens, it was about putting down roots, about a future that extended beyond the immediate crisis that had brought her to the ranch. Zach, whatever Joe might have said, was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. They both turned to see Billy galloping toward the house, dust rising behind him. "Raiders," he shouted as soon as he was within earshot. "Coming up from the south, at least a dozen." All thoughts of chicken coops and futures vanished as Zach's expression hardened. "Get to the house," he told Joe. "Take the colt and stay with Rosa." "I can help," Joe protested. "I'm a good shot now. Joe, please." His eyes met hers, urgent and intense. "I need to know you're safe." Something in his voice, raw fear for her, not himself, made her nod. "Be careful," she said before hurrying toward the house. Inside, Rosa was already closing shutters and gathering weapons. Joe helped her, moving with a calm efficiency that belied her racing heart. Through a gap in the shutters, she watched Zach, Charlie, and the recently returned Billy position themselves around the property, rifles ready. The raiders appeared minutes later, not in Confederate uniforms this time, but dressed in a motley collection of clothes that suggested they were no longer even pretending to fight for a cause. They were outlaws now, pure and simple, using the chaos of war as cover for their crimes. Joe recognized their leader instantly, the man with the scarred face who had demanded cattle from Zach weeks earlier. Captain Wells, if that was even his real name. Zach stood in the yard, rifle at his side but not raised. "Wells," he called, "thought we had an understanding." "Circumstances change, Mercer," Wells replied, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We know you're harboring a Union widow, woman named Norwood, whose husband was killed near Linden." Joe's blood ran cold. How had they known? Who had told them? "Don't know what you're talking about," Zach replied evenly. "No one here by that name." Wells's laugh was ugly. "Save your lies. We found a man in Willow Creek who saw her with you. Paid us good money to bring her, and seems she witnessed something she shouldn't have during the raid that killed her husband." Joe's mind raced. What had she seen? She'd been hidden in the root cellar, had only heard Thomas's murder, not seen it. Unless one of the raiders had seen her afterward, when she'd emerged to find Thomas's body. Perhaps they feared she could identify them. "This is my ranch," Zach said, his voice hard now. "Anyone staying here is under my protection. You want them, you go through me." Wells shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his pistol. "Don't be a fool, Mercer. There's 12 of us and 3 of you. We just want the woman. Give her to us and we'll leave the rest of you in peace." "That's not going to happen," Zach replied, his stance widening slightly, preparing. Joe knew what would come next: violence, bloodshed, possibly death. And for what? For her? The thought of Zach dying to protect her was unbearable. Before Rosa could stop her, Joe unbolted the door and stepped onto the porch. "I'm Josephine Norwood," she called, the Colt revolver steady in her hand though her heart pounded against her ribs. "If it's me you want, there's no need for anyone else to get hurt." "Joe, get back inside," Zach ordered, his voice sharp with fear. She ignored him, descending the porch steps. "What is it you think I saw, Captain Wells? Because I was hidden when your men murdered my husband. I heard everything, but I saw nothing." Wells's eyes narrowed. "A convenient claim, Mrs. Norwood, but not one we're inclined to believe. It's the truth," Joe insisted. "I can't identify any of your men. I was in the root cellar." "The problem, Mrs. Norwood," Wells said, "is that you know the raid happened at all. The official story is that Union deserters attacked loyal Southern homesteads. Your survival complicates that narrative." Joe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the summer heat. This wasn't about what she had witnessed, it was about erasing evidence that contradicted the story the raiders were telling to justify their actions. "I won't let you take her," Zach said, moving to stand between Joe and the raiders. Charlie and Billy had edged closer as well, their rifles now raised and ready. Wells sighed as if genuinely regretful. "Then you leave us no choice." What happened next unfolded with terrible swiftness. One of the raiders fired first, the shot going wide. Then the yard erupted in gunfire. Joe found herself pulled roughly to the ground by Zach as bullets splintered the wood of the porch behind them. "Stay down," he shouted, returning fire from a prone position. Joe's training took over. She rolled to the side of the porch steps, using them as cover, and fired the Colt at a raider who was trying to flank Charlie's position. Her shot caught him in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse, the air filled with gunsmoke and the thunder of rifles. Joe saw Billy take a hit and fall, saw Charlie drag him to safety behind the water trough. Rosa appeared at an upstairs window with a shotgun, firing at raiders who tried to approach the house. And through it all, Zach fought with the cool precision of a man who had done this before, each shot deliberate, each movement calculated to draw fire away from the others. 3 raiders were down when Wells shouted an order to regroup. The remaining outlaws pulled back, retreating beyond the range of rifles but not leaving entirely. In the momentary lull, Zach crawled to Joe's position. "Are you hit?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," she assured him. "Billy, shoulder wound, he'll live." Zach's face was grim. "They're regrouping, not leaving. We need to get to better positions." They made their way to the barn, where Charlie had already taken Billy. Rosa joined them minutes later, bringing bandages for the wounded young cowhand. "They will burn the house," Rosa predicted as she worked on Billy's shoulder. "Men like that, they burn what they cannot take. Let them try," Charlie growled. "Barn's easier to defend anyway." Joe helped Rosa tend to Billy while the men prepared for the next assault. The inside of the barn had been fortified. Zach, it seemed, had anticipated that someday they might need to defend the ranch. "How many bullets for the Colt?" Zach asked Joe as he checked his own weapons. 4 left, she replied. "And I know how to reload," he nodded, respect in his eyes. "Stay on the north side with Rosa. Charlie and I will take the south and east. They'll have to come across open ground to reach us, but watch for anyone trying to circle around." As if on cue, a shout came from outside, followed by the smell of smoke. Through a crack in the barn wall, Joe could see flames licking at the side of the ranch house. "Bastards," Charlie muttered. Zach's expression didn't change, but Joe saw his hands tighten on his rifle. That house represented years of work, of building something from nothing. Now it was being destroyed before his eyes. "The house doesn't matter," he said finally. "We can rebuild. Let's just make sure we're alive to do it." The raiders' next attack came from multiple directions at once. Shots peppered the barn walls as men approached on foot, using the smoke from the burning house as partial cover. Joe stationed herself at a small window, the Colt ready. When a raider attempted to reach the barn door, she fired, her shot catching him in the leg. He fell, crawling back toward the cover of the smoke. The exchange of gunfire continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The defenders' position in the barn gave them an advantage: solid walls for cover and clear lines of sight to any approach. But the raiders had numbers on their side, and the burning house was creating a dangerous distraction. When Joe had fired her last bullet, she turned to reload and saw Rosa slumped against the wall, blood seeping through her fingers where she clutched her side. "Rosa." Joe rushed to her, helping her lie flat. "Let me see." The wound was a bullet graze along Rosa's ribs, painful but not immediately life-threatening. Joe tore strips from her petticoat to bandage it tightly. "Stay still," she instructed. "The bleeding isn't too bad if you don't move." Rosa nodded weakly. "Be careful, Nina." Reloading the Colt with hands steadier than she felt, Joe returned to her position. Outside, she could hear Wells shouting orders, though the words were indistinct over the crackle of the burning house and the intermittent gunfire. Suddenly, a new sound joined the chaos: hoofbeats, many of them approaching from the west. Joe's heart sank. Reinforcements for the raiders would doom them all, but the reaction from Wells and his men suggested otherwise. Shouts of alarm rose, followed by a new barrage of gunfire not directed at the barn this time, but at the newcomers. "Cavalry," Charlie shouted from his position. "Union cavalry!" Relief flooded through Joe. Through her window, she could see blue uniforms as Union soldiers engaged the raiders, who were now caught in the open between two forces. The battle was brief and decisive. Outnumbered and outflanked, the raiders who could still ride fled, leaving their wounded behind. Wells was among those who escaped, a fact that would haunt Joe later. But in the moment, all that mattered was that the attack had been repelled. The cavalry lieutenant, a young man named Harker, explained that they had been pursuing Wells and his band for weeks. "They're not Confederate regulars," he told Zach as they stood amid the smoldering ruins of the ranch house. "Just criminals using the war as cover. We've been ordered to eliminate them." They seemed particularly interested in Mrs. Norwood, Zach said, glancing at Joe, who was helping a Union medic tend to Rosa and Billy. Lieutenant Harker nodded grimly. "Wells has been systematically eliminating witnesses to his raids, makes it harder for us to prove he's not acting under Confederate orders. Will you go after him?" Joe asked, approaching after ensuring Rosa was comfortable. "Immediately," Harker confirmed. "My men are already picking up their trail. We won't let them get away this time." The cavalry left 3 men behind to help with the wounded and protect the ranch in case the raiders returned, though Harker thought it unlikely. "They've lost too many men to risk another attack," he assured them. As the dust from the departing cavalry settled, Joe surveyed the destruction. The ranch house was a total loss, reduced to charred timbers and smoking rubble. The barn had numerous bullet holes but remained structurally sound. Most importantly, they had all survived, though Rosa and Billy would need time to recover from their wounds. Zach stood amid the ruins of his home, his face unreadable as he picked up a partially burned photograph his brother James in his Union uniform, Joe realized. One of the few personal possessions he had kept. She approached him quietly. "I'm so sorry, Zach, this is my fault." "If I hadn't been here, don't," he interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't blame yourself for the actions of evil men. But your home is still here." He gestured around them. "The land, the cattle, the people, that's what matters. The house is just timber and nails." "We can rebuild it." "We?" Joe asked softly. Zach turned to her then, the photograph still clutched in his hand. "I meant what I said before the raiders came, Joe. I want you to stay, not just until it's safe, not just until the war ends. I want you to stay because—" He faltered, then continued with quiet intensity. "Because in the midst of all this destruction, finding you has been the one thing that makes sense." Joe felt tears well in her eyes. "Zach, Thomas has only been gone a few months. I don't know if I'm ready." "I'm not asking for promises," he said gently. "Just a chance. A chance to see if what I feel for you, what I think you might feel for me, can grow into something real and lasting." Joe looked around at the ranch, at Rosa being tended by a cavalry medic, at Charlie organizing the remaining supplies, at Billy sitting up despite his wound to help sort through what could be salvaged. In the short time she had been there, these people had become important to her. And Zach. Zach had offered her protection without conditions, had given her a place to heal, had shown her that life could go on even after devastating loss. What had begun as desperate gratitude had evolved into something deeper, something she had been afraid to name. "Thomas would want me to be happy," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "He would want me to find safety and purpose again. And have you?" Zach asked, hope evident in his eyes. "Found those things here?" Joe reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "I think I've found the beginning of them. I'd like to stay and discover the rest." The smile that transformed Zach's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He raised their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we'll rebuild, together." In the days that followed, they began the process of recovery. The cavalry men helped clear the debris of the burned house while Charlie and Zach salvaged what lumber they could for temporary shelters. Rosa, despite her injury, directed the organization of their remaining supplies, ensuring nothing went to waste. For now, they all slept in the barn, partitioned areas offering minimal privacy. The arrangement was far from ideal, but there was a surprising camaraderie in their shared adversity. In the evenings, they gathered around a fire outside, sharing meals and stories as the summer stars appeared overhead. A week after the attack, Lieutenant Harker returned with news. Wells and most of his band had been captured attempting to raid another farm 20 miles south. They would face military justice for their crimes. "They won't trouble you again, Mrs. Norwood," Harker assured her. "The war's turning, and men like Wells are finding fewer places to hide." The knowledge that her primary persecutor had been captured lifted a weight from Joe's shoulders. For the first time since Thomas's death, she began to believe she might truly be safe. As June turned to July, construction on a new ranch house began. Smaller than the original, but sturdier, with stone foundations and thick walls. Zach, Charlie, and Billy worked from dawn to dusk, joined by neighbors from miles around who came to help. In the frontier tradition, community rallied when disaster struck one of their own. Joe threw herself into the work as well, cooking for the volunteers, helping Rosa tend the garden, and even learning to lay brick alongside the men. The physical labor was exhausting but satisfying tangible progress, visible proof that destruction could be overcome. In those weeks of rebuilding, Joe's relationship with Zach deepened. Their moments alone were few but precious. Sometimes they walked together at dusk, surveying the day's work and planning for tomorrow. Other times they sat on the partially built porch in the cool of evening, talking of their pasts and, increasingly, their future. "I never thought I'd find this again," Joe admitted one evening as they watched the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. "After Thomas died, I couldn't imagine ever feeling whole." "And now," Zach asked, his hand finding hers in the gathering darkness, "now I know that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding space in your heart for both grief and joy." She turned to face him. "You've helped me discover that, Zach. You've given me more than protection, you've given me hope." In the fading light, his eyes were tender as they met hers. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward. Their first kiss was gentle, a question rather than a demand. When Joe responded, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, the kiss deepened, becoming a promise between them. When they finally parted, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Josephine Norwood," he whispered. "I didn't expect to, but I do." Joe's heart swelled with an emotion she had feared she might never feel again. "I love you too," she replied, the words both terrifying and liberating. "God help me, I do." By August, the new house was livable, if not complete. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a common area simple but solid, with space to expand as needed. The day they moved in from the barn was a celebration, with Rosa preparing a feast and Charlie producing a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. That night, after the others had retired to their rooms, Joe and Zach stood alone in the kitchen. The house creaked and settled around them, new timber adjusting to its purpose. "It's a good home," Joe said, running her hand along the smooth surface of the table Zach had built. "Different from the old one, but good in its own way." "Like many things," Zach replied, his meaning clear. He took her hand, his expression serious. "Joe, I know it's soon. I know the proper period of mourning is much longer. But these aren't proper times, and life out here doesn't always follow the rules of civilization." Joe's breath caught as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it with me since I left Philadelphia, a reminder of where I came from. Now I'd like it to be a promise of where I'm going with you if you'll have me." Tears filled Joe's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Are you asking me to marry you, Zachary Mercer?" "I am," he confirmed, his voice husky with emotion. "Not right away if you're not ready, but someday, when you feel the time is right." Joe looked at the ring, then at the man before her, this good, honorable man who had offered protection without conditions and ended up giving her so much more. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, but her heart, she had discovered, was large enough for both her past love and her future one. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll marry you, Zach, not someday soon. Life is too uncertain to wait for perfect moments." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. "I promise you, Joe," he said, drawing her into his arms, "that for as long as I live, you will never face danger alone again. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," she echoed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Their wedding took place in September as golden light bathed the prairie and the first hint of autumn cooled the air. It was a simple ceremony at the ranch, performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Rosa decorated the new house with wildflowers, and Charlie and Billy scrubbed up so thoroughly they were barely recognizable. Jo wore a dress of pale blue cotton, sewn by her own hands. Around her neck hung Thomas's pocket watch, not as a symbol of mourning, but as acknowledgement that the past was part of her always. Zach, clean-shaven for the occasion, wore his best shirt and a new vest that Rosa had secretly made for him. The preacher spoke of new beginnings, of finding light after darkness, of the resilience of the human spirit, words that resonated deeply with both bride and groom. When Jo and Zach exchanged vows, their voices were steady with certainty. After the ceremony, their small community celebrated with food, music from Billy's battered fiddle, and dancing that lasted until the stars appeared. Jo, watching Zach laugh with Charlie as they attempted to teach Rosa a Virginia reel, felt a profound sense of peace. This was her home now, these people her family. Later, as husband and wife retired to the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Zach took Jo's hands in his. "Happy?" he asked simply. "More than I thought possible," she replied honestly. "6 months ago, I was hiding in a ravine, certain I would die. Now I'm here with you, with a future I can believe in." "The war will end," Zach said, drawing her close. "Perhaps not this year, but soon, and when it does, we'll build something lasting here. Something our children and their children can be proud of." "Children," Jo repeated softly. "I'd like that." His kiss was tender at first, then deepening with desire as they embraced the new intimacy of marriage. In each other's arms, they found not just passion, but healing, the final acknowledgement that life continues, that love persists even in the face of loss. As 1863 gave way to 1864, news from the wider world confirmed what Zach had predicted: the tide of war was turning decisively in the Union's favor. Confederate forces were in retreat across multiple fronts, and though fighting continued, the eventual outcome seemed increasingly clear. In Kansas, the raids diminished as Union control solidified. The Mercer Ranch prospered under Zach and Jo's combined management. She brought order and efficiency to the household accounts, identifying ways to increase profits and expand their holdings. He continued to build their reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle. Together, they created something neither could have achieved alone. Rosa stayed on, declaring that she was too old to start over elsewhere and that someone needed to make sure they didn't work themselves to death. Charlie and Billy remained as well, loyal to the ranch that had become a home to them all. In the spring of 1864, Jo discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought Zach to tears of joy, and the entire ranch celebrated the coming addition to their family. The second bedroom, which had remained largely unfinished, was quickly transformed into a nursery, with Zach spending his evenings crafting a cradle from the same wood that had built their home. On a warm November day, as the last leaves clung to the cottonwoods along the creek, Josephine Mercer gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas Zachary Mercer, honoring the past while embracing the future. "He has your eyes," Jo whispered as Zach held his son for the first time, wonder evident on his face. "And your determination," Zach replied, smiling as the infant gripped his finger with surprising strength. "He'll need it out here." As 1865 dawned, news arrived that would forever change the nation. The war was over. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse marked the beginning of a long, difficult road to reunion and reconstruction. But for ordinary citizens like the Mercers, it meant something simpler and more profound: the promise of peace. In the years that followed, the Mercer ranch grew and thrived. Zach's skill with cattle and Joe's head for business proved a formidable combination. They added acreage, increased their herd, and even opened a small general store in the rebuilt town of Linden, providing supplies to the influx of settlers who came west after the war. Their family grew as well. Thomas was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, in 1867, and another brother, James, in 1870. The house expanded accordingly, with new rooms added as needed. What had begun as a desperate refuge became a true home filled with children's laughter, the comfort of family meals, and the quiet contentment of love that had emerged from the ashes of loss. On the 10th anniversary of the day Zach had found Joe at the creek, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard that had once been the scene of violence and destruction. "You ever think about that day?" Joe asked, leaning against her husband's solid presence. "When you found me by the water, often," Zach admitted, his arm tightening around her waist. "I think about how close I came to riding past, about what my life would have been without you." Joe looked up at him, at the face she had come to know as well as her own, lined now with a decade of weather and laughter, but still handsome, still the face of the man who had offered protection when she needed it most. "The war left me widowed and seeking any safety," she said softly. "You offered protection without conditions, but you gave me so much more than that, Zach. You gave me a chance to live again, not just survive." "We gave that to each other," he replied, bending to kiss her gently, "and we built something neither of us could have imagined that day by the creek." As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the land in the same blood-red haze that had witnessed Joe's desperate flight a decade earlier, she and Zach called their children in for dinner. The family gathered around the table that had been one of the first pieces of furniture in their rebuilt home, bowed their heads for grace, and gave thanks for the peace and prosperity they had found. Outside, the wind whispered through prairie grass, carrying with it the memory of harder times and the promise of better ones to come. On the Mercer Ranch, a family born of war's destruction continued the everyday miracle of building life from loss, of finding love where there had been only fear, of creating safety in a world that offered no guarantees. And in the heart of that family, Josephine and Zachary Mercer held fast to the truth they had discovered together, that even in the darkest of times, hope remains for those brave enough to reach for it.